Good afternoon, Ministers. My name is Claudia Langevin, and these are my colleagues, Molly McGuire, Stephen Rush, and Dietrich Gunther. And today we are here to discuss housing affordability in Canada. We'll also be touching on some jurisdictional problems from our province of Ontario. So just to quickly brief on the agenda we'll be going over today, we'll be looking at some backgrounds, some objectives, some policy options, an implementation strategy, and then some concluding remarks. So the problem is that the changing market pressures render the National Housing Strategy unable to meet its target of raising 530,000 Canadian households out of core housing need in the next decade. Currently, there are 1.7 million Canadian households in core housing need. Of that, the National Housing Strategy seeks to address 530,000, or 1/3 of this 1.7 million. Core housing need is defined under three categories by CMHC, which are affordability, suitability, and adequacy. And if I can point to this graph with data retrieved from CMHC, we're seeing that affordability is the primary driver of housing challenges in Canada, with 90% of those in core housing need experiencing this problem. So we can see here that there's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. Now, predominantly, we're going to discuss the Canadian landscape, and the Canadian landscape looking at 6 key factors here that address some challenges that we see within the renting landscape in Canada. So 2 that I'd like to point to, the first being that 40% of millennials are in the gig economy, and this demonstrates a common theme of mobility. The second theme is that 35% of young adults between the ages of 20 and 35 are still living at home, which demonstrates an affordability symptom within the housing landscape in Canada. Now, looking at this graph here with data that we've analyzed from CMHC, we're looking at rented versus owner homes. So there are 4.4 million renter households in Canada. Of that, 1 million are in a core housing need. And looking at this graph here, we're noticing that this core housing need also goes across different demographics, looking at people of different ages and cohorts, not just young families, and predominantly renters. On top of this, in December, the president of CMHC noted that any strategy moving forward needs to address renting within a housing affordability strategy. Just to emphasize a little bit more of the point from data analyzed at CMHC, we're seeing that not only young families are experiencing core housing needs, but different types of families and non-family situations. And these are all predominantly renters, not owned homes. Now, as a visual for this presentation, we are looking at a housing continuum. So traditionally in Canada, housing has followed the scope of dependent housing into semi-dependent rental into the end goal of independent home ownership. Now, we are proposing that this is not always the case because of these changing landscapes in Canada, some of which that with mobility within the gig economy and affordability issues, some people are seeking renting as a long-term option. Now, I'd like to invite my colleague Molly to discuss that there are jurisdictional and provincial constraints that we'll be talking about.
In the province of Ontario, it's important to look at the housing situation because of those in core housing need, 769,000 are found in this province. That is approximately half of those in need. And the trends we're seeing in Canada towards renting for people who value mobility, independence, and autonomy are existent within Ontario, so much so that 1.6 million Ontarians rent instead of own homes. This is seen writ large in large CMAs like Toronto, where 500,000 people rent, and medium CMAs, such as Ottawa, where about 20,000 or 100,000 rent. Other issues that these renters face in Ontario specifically include the increasing population. From 2017 to 2021, the population of Ontario is expected to increase by 713,000 people, 140,000 of whom will be immigrants. Now, these are individuals coming from all across Canada or coming from other countries, and they will tend to settle in usually the same regions, which means that the supply of housing will continue to be limited and affordability will continue to be an issue, if not a greater issue, as the supply is tapped and demand rises. Other issues facing Ontarians specifically are rent eviction. So this instances of rent eviction are up 294% in the province. Rent eviction essentially is when a landowner decides to commodify their property by renovating. So they'll evict the tenants, they'll renovate, and then they'll increase the price of rent or of home ownership so that person who used to live there can no longer afford it, and everyone around has to pay a higher price. So it's the affordability we must target. And again, as we've mentioned, the affordability issue is not as prevalent among young families who are seeking homes, but actually among all Canadians who are seeking to rent, as is the case with Ontario. The constraints on housing supply are listed here. I'd like to draw your attention to speculation, short-term rentals, and foreign ownership. All of these put a tax on the supply of housing that we have in Canada and in Ontario. Speculation, raising the price because the properties are being commodified. Short-term rentals, meaning that there are ghost hotels in places where people cannot rent long-term, which would ordinarily be a part of that supply. And foreign ownership, which accounts for vacancies of 66,000 in the Greater Toronto Area and 20,000 in Ottawa. As a federal government, with the National Housing Strategy, we have pledged to act, but our ways of doing so are limited because of jurisdictional constraints. Under Sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution, it's not specifically said that housing falls under the purview of the provincial or municipal governments, but this has been the conventional case. Therefore, as a federal government, to help these 1.7 million Canadians in core housing need, the levers available to us are limited, but nevertheless can be effective. And to engage those stakeholders, not only the governmental ones, but the non-governmental organizations and not-for-profit agencies who are devoted to getting Canadians into affordable, suitable, and adequate homes. We need to have strong leadership to coordinate their efforts and proper bilateral communications to ensure that everyone is on the same page. There's also the perception of renting, which must be altered. Systemically, renting has not been a lifelong viable option. The housing continuum exists as it does because there is a gap where people who are renters cannot grow their equity, and lifelong renting is not profitable and it's not affordable. But we can change this. The National Housing Strategy currently weighs in the favor of homeowners. About 80% of the initiatives in the NHS favor supply initiatives, which primarily help homeowners, and then about 20% of initiatives target homelessness. This means that it helps those who do not have a home to find shelter, and it also helps those who are in a position to become homeowners. But anyone in the middle, namely renters, are hardly helped. There are only, in fact, 2 policies in the NHS which help them. Therefore, if we would like to see Canadians raised out of core housing need, which is the targeted objective of the National Housing Strategy, we need to address that gap to make sure that it's not just people who can become homeowners, but we also have to have a way of helping renters. And therefore, we have come up with 3 possible options to do so to truly raise Canadians out of core housing need.
Thank you, Molly. So, as laid out by my colleagues in the background here, we have determined that the policy objectives, that any policy intervention that we implement here needs to address these 4 things. It needs to, first and foremost, reduce the number of people in core housing need in Canada. It needs to increase the accommodation supply in the Canadian housing market. It needs to provide incentives for rental tenure to make rental a viable lifelong option for Canadians. And, critically, it needs to ensure that there are short-term tangible outcomes in the short timeline of 12 to 15 months as identified by the Prime Minister at the outset of this process. So, our analysis has yielded 3 options that we see as possible moving forward. The first is a public housing program. Second is a partnerships approach. And third, a lifelong rental tenure package of policy interventions. Now, moving into more detail and our assessment of these options, the first is a public housing program, which would involve a creation of rental units to come under the mandate of CMHC, giving the federal government the power and ability to increase the rental supply across Canada. We saw success with similar programs like this, such as the Wartime Housing Limited at the end of World War II, which attempted to house veterans coming home from the war, which built 50,000 homes post that in that crisis. And now, while we are not in the same crisis situation now, we are in a similar situation which has urgency to act. With this program, as you can see in our assessment factors to the right of the screen, this would reduce the core housing need for Canadians by raising the supply. It would increase the supply of housing, but the rental incentives required to fill that gap identified by my colleague Molly will not come into effect, and the short-term timeline identified by the Prime Minister would not be addressed given the time it would take to build these rental units by the federal government. Our second option, partnerships, was considered, and this would involve increasing the funding to initiatives such as the Rental Construction Housing Initiative, which has seen success in the recent years. This would establish new partnerships with developers, build a relationship with nonprofits and partner with the provinces and municipalities closely to prioritize the diversification of housing stock in cities. As you can see, this would reduce the core housing need, it would increase the supply, but again, would not provide the rental incentives required to make renting a lifetime option for Canadians, and we would not be able to establish these partners in the short time frame of 12 to 15 months. And so, given these assessments of the first two options, our recommendation will be lifelong rental tenure. This policy option will involve a package of policies identified to target renters specifically. First, a federal renter's benefit, which would increase the income for Canadians who are in core housing need, who are renting. It will increase the contribution limits to TFSAs and RRSPs, specifically for renters, and this would be to mimic the asset building that we see in homeownership on the rental side of the continuum. Then secondly, there will be a package of taxes levied against properties in Canada. So we will implement a speculation tax, as well as a national vacancy tax, and a decrease in capital gains subject to landlords called the landlord benefit. And also, critically, given the promise of several policies, the policies in the NHS, we will allow those policies over time to take effect with the addition of these recommendations to fill that gap identified by my colleagues. And so as you can see, given the policy objectives identified on our background assessment, the lifelong rental tenure reduces core housing need, it increases the supply with the tax policies we will implement, and it provides the rental incentives, and we will be able to move forward with tangible outcomes in the next 12 to 15 months. And now I will have my colleague Dietrich lay out how this implementation process will proceed.
Thank you, Stephen. So everything that we're proposing, the foundation for everything that we're proposing is the National Housing Strategy. So we're not taking anything away from what's already in place. We're adding to it or augmenting it. So the two programs that we're looking at are the direct benefits to renters and also new tax measures. So as you can see by the timeline behind me, because these are things that are could be built into the federal budget for this year, these are things that could take effect during the 2021 fiscal year. So as per normal, the budget will come down likely within March or April. And if that is the case, the new benefits for renters could be implemented by the summer, and the new tax measures could be implemented by the fall. So this meets one of the critical objectives of the short timeline. So the federal renter's benefit would be a refundable income tax benefit of up to $3,000 for only those houses, for only those rental houses that are in core housing need. So not every renter in Canada. And the reason that we've chosen it to be a income tax benefit is so that we don't actually increase the income of those in core housing need. Because one of the problems with increasing the income of people in core housing need is that it could actually detrimentally affect other social benefits that they're receiving because it would actually increase their annual income. The second one is the increased contribution limits for the TFSA and the RRSPs. And so we're looking at that as a way because many people pursue home ownership as a way to build equity for long-term financial stability, or what they perceive to be long-term financial stability. And by increasing TFSA and RRSP contribution limits for renters, and this could be all renters and not just those renters in core need, it will add some of that long-term financial stability that people perceive comes with home ownership. So under the new tax measures, the first one is a speculation tax. And currently, when somebody sells a secondary property, an investment property, so something that's not their primary residence, they pay tax on 50% of the capital gains. So what we're looking at is, in order to encourage people to keep properties for longer, is to implement tax on 100% of capital gains if a property is purchased and sold within a year. And that amount would slide downward over the course of 10 years. So if somebody were to purchase and sell a home within 1 year, it would be 100% of the capital gains would be taxed, all the way down to only 10% of capital gains being taxed after 10 years. This is an initiative to cool the market in order to help to keep prices from rising too quickly, and also to provide some stability in the rental market. The second initiative under this would be the national vacancy tax. And this idea, let's say we borrowed from the City of Vancouver, who actually has a vacancy tax It was originally set at 1%. It's currently set at 1.25% of the assessed value of properties that are vacant for 180 days or more during a year. And since 2016, this has actually generated $39 million of income for the City of Vancouver, which they direct to affordable housing benefit programs. And it's a good news, bad news story for the City of Vancouver because, first of all, it's good news because $39 million more is going towards affordable housing. However, it's bad news because if that much money is being generated, it's showing that the imposition of a 1 or 1.25% tax on vacancies is not really an effective deterrent. So we're looking to amp that up to about 5%, and do it across the country. And the revenue from that would be shared with the provinces for their own affordable housing and housing affordability programs, and the rest of the surplus money would be directed into the National Housing Strategy as additional revenue sources. In addition to the 5% of foreign-owned, we're recommending that a 1% on domestically owned properties in the same situation be implemented across the country. The last program that we're recommending is the landlord benefit. So again, currently capital gains are taxed, 50% of capital gains are taxed on a personal income tax. So the landlord benefit, we're not looking at corporations that own properties, we're looking at individuals, small business landlords that would be able to enjoy this tax. And so they would only be taxed on 45% of the capital gains instead of 50%, which would cause incentive or provide incentive for them to not speculate. It would give them a little bit more money, so it's a little bit more attractive for small landlords, small business landlords to go into business. So some initial numbers here that you can see behind me. And the one that I would really like to draw your attention to is the renter's benefit, and I'm sure that everybody in the room is as capable of doing some quick math as I am. So we're looking at a $3 billion cost for that annually. But honestly, it's a very large number, but it's a large number that will give, I think, an extremely high value to Canadian taxpayers' money. Because we're talking about 1 million taxpayers, or correction, 1 million households across the country that are in core housing need. If we're providing this money to them, we're talking about affecting millions of Canadians with it, because it's a household, not individuals. And so we really feel that this is something that is important to implement and something that we really should be implementing. And keep in mind that as the National Housing Strategy as a whole, plus the augmentations that we're proposing, come to fruition over its lifetime, the number of those in core housing need will decrease, and so this $3 billion figure will decrease incrementally year by year as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who will take you through the communications plan.
Evidently, communication is a critical piece of this implementation, since we will have to inform Canadians of a whole suite of policies available to them that will make renting profitable, affordable, and possible. At a Canadian level, we just want the message to say simply that the government is here for renters. The National Housing Strategy, it will help people who are homeowners. But with this augmented strategy that we've proposed today, then renters too will be helped by this policy, and it will become more affordable, and we will get Canadians out of core housing need. We recommend using the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity in conjunction with CMHC and ESDC. So this way, we have a minister whose responsibility is to help those who are not part of the low income bracket, who are not part of the 1%, those who lie in the core housing need we've discussed today, to get the message out there and help them to become lifelong renters. At the provincial level, we can stress the importance to the economy of a rental economy. It allows Canadians to move from one region to the next, to where the jobs are, so we can alleviate labor shortages, we can alleviate the diminishing returns of having a concentration of labor in one area. And at the municipal level, as has been traditionally done by the government, we can share best practices and sustainable architectural plans to intensify and densify cities using the medium of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Overall, this proposition will see short-term, tangible outcomes. We will help these Canadians get monies into their pocket within the next 12 to 15 months. And most importantly, of those 1.7 million Canadians in core housing need who don't have homes that are suitable, that are adequate, or most critically, that are affordable, we will help get them out of core housing need and serve the 1 million of that portion who are renters and who have yet to be acknowledged by the National Housing Strategy out of that core housing need as well. It will help Canada, it will help Ontario, it will help Canadians, and we will get them into the homes they need for the lives they want. Any questions?
Thank you. We do have some questions. I'm going to start with my colleague who happens to know quite a bit about tax, Mark Brazeau.
Interesting proposal. One thing I'm wondering, so we're talking about add $3 billion in a renter's benefit and the math after that. But what's the impact? What do we get? I mean, this is a big number, right? So for $3 billion, what are we getting?
So the $3 billion would work out to roughly $250 a month per renter household in core housing need. And so done in conjunction with something like the Canada Housing Benefit, which is up to $3,000 more per year, in the most needy households would have up to $500 a month provided to them. So what we're getting from that is we're getting the ability for them to get ahead of the debt that they're in, to be able to move from affordable housing into housing market, whether it's rental or purchasing. So it's really there to help them make that jump out of the slide with the blue houses to the green houses.
And from a purely Ontario or Ottawa perspective, what would be the impacts there?
I don't remember the numbers for the.
You talked about it being like roughly half of the problem in your opening comment.
Right. So it's 769,000 Ontarians are in core housing need, and the renters portion of that is the lion's share.
Okay.
I would say about 10%, we had a graph earlier, about 10% of those incidences of core housing need were for households, the rest were for renters. And so the benefit for a region like Ottawa or for Ontario would specifically be that those renters would be able to be lifted out of core housing need.
Okay, thank you.
François Blais.
Okay, about the renters' benefits, very interesting, but are you sure there is really a renter benefit or an owner benefit? Because the owner could be interested to raise the price for the rent. There is no risk for that?
So as Molly had mentioned earlier in the presentation, about 80% of the National Housing Strategy as currently designed is to increase the supply of housing, both rental and home ownership. Yeah. And so this is, I'm thinking short term, the 7-ish years that are left in the National Housing Strategy. As those projects and as the partners start building the units and as the housing supply increases, supply and demand forces would mean that the price will start to come down over time anyway. So, I mean, I agree.
Sure about that?
The economic theory would support that statement.
Yeah.
So while I'm not sure of it, there's some economists that would agree with that for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And
you don't see any risks for the rent benefit to be absorbed, yes, by the owners.
So that the rent will just raise by $250 a month?
So, but at the same time, at least in the case of the small business landlords, we're also providing them added incentives, right, with the 5% less of capital gains that they're paying taxes on. So we included that as a carrot to them to try to avoid situations like that.
I mean, technically, how does that work? We will send checks every month for $250 per person?
No, it's part of an individual's annual income tax return.
Oh, income tax return.
Yeah.
And can I just add one thing? One important point about this renter's benefit that we really want to emphasize is that traditionally we've seen housing is a form of a retirement nest egg. So that's going to be your asset into retirement. But why we really want to emphasize this additional money coming into renter households is that it provides more funding that can be put into savings plans such as TFSAs and RRSPs, which do create that long-term asset. So it's shifting to these changing landscapes and addressing some challenges while also giving people the option to save with that additional funding.
And additionally, the same argument could be made about the home buyers plans that the Canadian government currently has. If a buyer knows that the government is kicking in 5% of equity, if they know that land transfer taxes will be reimbursed by the province of Ontario, for example, if they know that some of the purchase of a home, I think up to $5,000 of federal income on your federal income tax return can be reimbursed in the purchase of a new home. I mean, the same thing happens when these incentives go to home buyers, where sellers know that these things are there, and that could also cause them to inflate the prices as well as a landlord raising the rent, know that the renters are getting benefits.
Turn to my colleague from CMHC.
Yeah, a couple questions. I'll focus on one maybe right now. As part of your policy implementation, you had national vacancy tax.
Yes.
And so it would require quite a lot of policing and negotiation with each province on how to do that. And part of what you had was domestic-owned investor. How would you propose that would be implemented or policed as such?
So right now, Vancouver actually does have quite a good model, and I would suggest starting from their what they've got in place. And so what they have is they have a homeowners or a property owner's declaration that's filled in every year, and it basically voluntarily says, I own this property, I live at it, or I own this property, I don't live at it. And then based on those returns, they impose the tax or not. And so I believe the number is more than 90% of homeowners voluntarily fill in those forms every year.
Ariane?
Yes. I was wondering, of the 1 million household in core housing need that are renters, have you looked at how what you're proposing is going to affect all of these households? They're not all the same, young families, immigrants, famille monoparentale, for example. Do you know, have you looked into what you're proposing is going to affect them all equally, or?
Sure. So it would be a universal credit, and so it would all affect them individually. It would be per household, and so each home would receive the same benefits, and it would ultimately, in conjunction with the National Housing Strategy, we would see supply rise, and so more people would get in homes, and we would be able to accommodate the foreseeable immigrant influx and the changing market of Canadians.
So a family of 6 would get the same amount as a family of 2?
It would be per household, yes. But then in addition, you have to remember in their tax returns, they also are receiving some alleviations from their child benefits and the other supports that exist within our tax frame.
Okay, thank you.
Andre?
Yeah, but just to pick up on that, so everybody would get the same amount. How do you just justify that before the public or before different constituencies?
It would be established based on income on your tax return. So if you are above the 30% of your income is going towards housing, that will put you in the affordability bracket. And then I believe it's based on that portion of your income that goes towards housing. That would be the federal renter's benefit. So it would be a percentage of the total 3,000, up to 3,000 per year.
3,000 is the maximum.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. But how do you prevent owners to raise their rent just because they know that their people would get additional money? How do you prevent the perverse effect? Or
yeah, and the approach that one of the risk mitigation factors that we installed here for that is the landlord benefit, where they would be incentivized to have more houses as a result of their increased capital gains income in order to offset the amount of profit that they would see from the renter's benefit. So they see more profit in the capital gains tax, and so they would be less likely to be pushing forward into profiting on the renting.
And also, this is where our strategy works, as Molly was saying, in conjunction with the provinces and that cooperation aspect, because certain provinces now do have rent caps. So working in collaboration, that's where we can address those issues and support that aspect moving forward, so we don't have landlords dramatically increasing rent, because we are trying to cool down the markets and keep people in their existing homes.
I just have 2 quick questions in the minute that remains to us. I take it that what you're proposing is all federal tools here. This is a federal package, so you're not counting on the provinces to do this, that, or the other. You're saying we can do this as a government, as a Canadian government?
Yes.
Point number one. Point number with $3 billion. Now, but my second question is, I noticed there is a blank here on the revenues that you expect from the speculation tax. So do you have any idea how much the $3 billion would be mitigated by the revenues from the speculation tax? Can you give us a ballpark figure?
So is that the box where it's a plus minus?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so what that's meant to convey, and maybe I should have explained that better, was that initially we think that, we would get a large amount of money because we're taxing more of the capital gains. But over time, as people kind of learn their lesson, that amount would
Oh, I see.
reduce.
Okay, so it's an initial, maybe we get an initial benefit, but it would scale down.
Yeah, like as people end up suddenly realizing that, trying to flip a house, they have to pay all of that tax on all that capital
They make a
gains.
loan up for
They
home.
realize how badly they get hit, they learn their lesson and they don't do it again.
Thank you very much. Very
Thank you very
interesting.
much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.